And welcome back to the third and final segment of our show this morning, where we are about to commence a conversation with representatives from A.S.R. B.S.I. As you guys would have been following in last week's newscast, there have been developments in the New River in the Orange Walk district. And so Neal, he's the Communications and Government Affairs Officer, and Seidy Lienez, is that correct? Lienez. Seidy Lienez is the Regional Environmental Health and Safety Manager at A.S.R. B.S.I., and they are here to discuss the company's role in this entire situation. Good morning, folks.
Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for having us.
Good morning.
Good morning. Where do we begin from? Because we took a tour of the New River last Monday, where it was fairly evident what we saw on the ground, so to speak. And some of it is being attributed to the activities of A.S.R. B.S.I.
Well, I want to start off by addressing that river tour from the point of view that to the untrained eye, you know, there's a lot more happening than if you're not a trained scientist, you would be able to just say that this is the reason why this is happening. Obviously, because of the conditions that weather-wise, we're in a drought. It has been extremely dry and without rain. And the river is stressed. This happens annually after the dry season, and it's nothing new. However, this year it has been especially bad because of all the climate change conditions, which include the drought. So there are a number of factors at play. It's hard to point fingers at one particular contributor to this situation, because it's a myriad of factors that has led to this. And you have to approach it from the point of view where you're looking to say, okay, is what we're seeing what is the cause, or is it just a symptom of the reality that the river now faces? A.S.R. is a corporate citizen that takes the whole responsibility of the river and environment very, very seriously. We love the river. We as a company are the only ones who are actually monitoring the river. There are 13 points on the river where we do monitoring daily. It spans more than 7 miles. From the trial farm straight down to where the toll bridge is. And Seidy can go a little bit more in detail with that.
Yeah. So, well, William mentioned the monitoring of the river, which we call river surveys, right? But we also have internal monitoring as part of our compliance, complying with the environmental compliance plan set forth by the D.O.E. So we, on a daily basis, there are some points that we monitor internally. But what we have seen in the past months, you know, in terms of the river, we have seen that the behavior of the river has been changing, not only this year, but years before. There has been a gradual change, particularly when we reach the months of April, May. That's when we see that change happening. For instance, for this year, what we were able to see in the monthly river surveys that we normally do, we were able to see that a change started to happen around the month of May. Particularly, you know, it was mid to the late portion of May. We did see an increase in the levels of total dissolved solids as well as conductivity, and that led us to believe that there was something that was triggering these high levels, including sulfates, because we did see those 3 parameters changing. So because we monitor, we were able to also see that the salinity was coincidentally also rising. So we were able to attribute the rise in these 3 previously mentioned parameters to the increase in salinity. And what does this really mean is that at the end of the day, it just means that there is salt or seawater intrusion into the fresh water, which is the New River. So that was something that we saw happening 2 months before this actual, the whitening or the greening effect of the river.
Well, we have gotten a response from the Department of Environment, and they've said that the problem is eutrophication, which is too much nutrients in the water. Now, clearly, what was said by the Department of Environment is that in addition to the drought and the stagnant water and this being a cyclical problem, there is a problem of runoff. This is clearly stated by the Department of Environment. Now, where they did not identify all entities that may be contributing to the runoff, they did identify B.S.I. And so I want to talk about that because where this is a yearly problem, where we know that when you talk about runoff, it means something's being put in the water that perhaps disrupts what it should naturally be. And we know that B.S.I. has to put water into the river, or I'm assuming it's water. I want to talk about your contribution and how do you address that to residents of Orange Walk?
Well, one of the things, and Seidy can get into a little bit more technical aspect of this.
Yeah.
We treat our water before it's returned to the river. So there's nothing toxic that is returned to the water. Where there is a challenge for us is the amount of heat that goes back into the river with that water. The temperature, ambient temperature, as you pointed out, is a part of the challenge that we have. It's already hot. So when you're taking in that water, it's hot. And it's warm, it's hot. And it goes through the process for our processes, and heat is added. We do have a process of trying to cool that water down, but there are some challenges there. And we are on a 5-year plan with the Department of Environment to remedy that situation.
Yeah.
So there's nothing that is going in the river in terms of anything toxic or anything that we're adding to water.
There's no effluents being put into the water. It's just the heat, you're saying, the temperature.
Right.
So I want to understand this clearly because we don't want people to walk away and say, you're just putting water back into the river. What is actually being pumped out of B.S.I. and going into the new river? And what processes does it go through before that?
I'm hoping that we're able to pull up the presentation there. She'll be able to give you a good overview of what happens. But we do have a pond purification system, which includes, for example, adding good bacteria to break down whatever is there. So that water is not released directly into the river. It goes through a series of ponds. There are 4 ponds, and Seidy can explain what happens with each pond before it goes back into a creek that feeds into the river.
Yeah. So you take your wastewater, that's what we're talking about, your wastewater from producing the sugar.
So let me first start by explaining that cane itself, you guys, we grind cane. So what makes a big portion out of that juice after the crushing happens at the mill? The cane comes with 75%, almost of 75% of it is water. So that is already an ingress. So we process sugar, but we also process water, starting from that point. Then we have the water that we abstract or you inject it into the processes, and really this is used for the creation of vacuum because it's just the way the crystallization process requires vacuum to be created. How do you create vacuum? Is by abstracting the water, pulling it out, create the vacuum, and bring it back out. Nothing is added in that process other than it just being emitted and having the increase, a slight increase in temperature or the temperature loading that we have. So that water, no chemical addition, nothing happens. It's used for a purpose, and that purpose is the creation of vacuum. Now, when we wash or when we have liquidation or when we have spills or something that requires treatment because it contains organic loading, then what we would do is pass that through our effluent treatment system. The effluent treatment system is composed of 4 ponds and a buffer pond. So, and it's important for me to say effluent treatment system because then we also have a cooling process, right? But that will be explained a little bit after. So right now, let's focus on the wastewater. The wastewater goes through the sponge system, We use effective microorganisms. I think it's the same one that citrus uses because we source that out from bile. And effective microorganisms, what are they? It's a cocktail of good bacteria. And of course, they break down the effluent or the wastewater. So they do their work. And after they do their work, we go monitoring from pond to pond, how effective this treatment is. If there is a need for us to increase that, then we would do exactly that. We will increase it because we have to ensure that upon reaching the fourth pond, that the water is safe to be discharged into the effluent stream.
Now, Seidy, this is a very scientific process that I hear you explaining. And what, if I could just kind of simplify it the way I'm understanding it, is that basically you take the wastewater, you use natural organisms to kind of return it back to the safest form of water to be pumped back into the river. My question is, how much, because you have a river monitoring process as well, how much does the results of what the status of the river, how much does that influence your treatment system?
Actually, what we discharge, I think your question is, once it comes out of the pond number 4, which is the last treatment, it unites with what is coming out on the main drain, and that is what is discharged now into a cooling pond. Why is it that we go to a cooling pond system before it's discharged into the river? Because once it comes out of pond number 4, all the parameters pertaining to sugar processing have to be met. But we recognize that there is this need for additional cooling, not necessarily because what comes out of the effluent ponds. Because remember, in the effluent ponds, you are giving it enough residence time for it to go from pond to pond that it cools down, right? So the problem is, what I was indicating earlier, is what we have coming out of our for the creation of vacuum, because these two streams unite. And so when they unite, then we know that it meets water with an elevated temperature.
Yeah. So it's hot water meeting with what is room temperature water.
And then it needs additional cooling.
Yes.
So we have a cooling pond system that is arranged in series. So it goes from a cooling pond, and at the end of it discharges into a stream that eventually leads to the river.
And that water, when it leaves that final pond, is tested by B.S.I to ensure that it is safe.
Yes. It is tested at 15 different points throughout the river. So we monitor, for instance, what is coming in, what is going through the ponds, what's coming out of our main drain, after it passes the cooling ponds, before it enters the river, after it enters the river. And on a monthly basis, what we have up pre-toll bridge, we call the first sampling point is pre-toll bridge, all the way up to trial farm. So because we know that temperature is one of the issues we're having, especially like I said, when we have the hotter months coming in, like May, for instance, this year we saw elevated temperature starting from, I mean, it has been particularly dry, but the temperature has been very, very hot. So May, June, July. And every time people always say, why is it that every time the factory ends, this thing happens? Well, two things. Every time the factory ends in June, we have that's when it's hot, summer in. So also contributing that the ambient conditions are a factor. And also the fact that the rains start. So normally in June, it's when also the rains would, like the first rains would start to come. And why I mentioned this, because you mentioned erosion and sedimentation, right? And that is when whatever has been out there, is finally getting its way in.
It's rinsing into the river. Now, so what I hear from you is that you are testing your process, and clearly you've gone through extensive work to ensure that the wastewater is treated, and that whatever is returning back into the natural environment is as pure as you can possibly make it. Your main challenge is the temperature of the water.
Right.
It's warmer than what would normally be in place. But yet we hear of this problem perhaps being, the eutrophication problem being an issue that does include, in addition to all the natural factors, it happens on a yearly basis. There's a bit of runoff that will take place. But we do know that there's agricultural runoff as well. You are the biggest industry in Orange Walk, and quite naturally people will look at the biggest industry and say, what are you doing to our water? And especially since they see streams of water going back into the river. How do you work along with the community to have them understand that you have been doing, or what you're saying is you have been doing your part?
Well, it's a bit of a conundrum of sorts, because people, as you rightly said, will immediately think that it's B.S.I's fault. But I think with the pictures that we've provided, you'll see, as Seidy has been explaining, that we have been tracking through the points that we have on the river, the eutrophication, the greening of the river, also the white film that we have on top of the river.
Yeah.
All of that, it started all the way up by Trial Farm and started coming down. With our pictures, we were able, because we do the daily monitoring, we could actually see that actually making its way down towards us. It didn't get to B.S.I until about somewhere around the 25th.
Actually, it was the 5th of August. We started seeing changes in May. I indicated to you in terms of parameters. But what we were able to see was that nothing. The river did not manifest any of these changes until July 16. So it was in July 16 that we first started, it became like in the media, it was all out. So we did see.
That's when you could see the
actual.
Right. Yeah.
So like William, I think William mentioned, you don't know whether this is a consequence or whether this is the cause. Because it can be that it's some white material being discharged into it. We don't know. But what we were seeing was whitening. And if you guys have been really following it, you would have noticed that everything started with a whiteness. Then all of a sudden, it's a greening, right? So there was different, the characteristics change over time, but these characteristics were not seen at our injection area, which is where we abstract and where it would be evident. Because many times when we have fish kills, what we would tend to see is that because we have barges coming in, some of it would be dragged even from upstream coming towards us. So what we do normally when we see this situation, we would call the D.O.E and say, you know what, there's a fish kill down. We did not see that coming to us.
Well, that was going to be my next question. In May, when you started to see the differences in your readings, beyond, so what you're saying, it was upstream, it was before the river met.
The entire river actually was changing.
Did you flag this to the Department of Environment?
We do submit our monthly river surveys to them. So in terms of parameters that we normally submit to them would be conductivity, dissolved oxygen, because with eutrophication, what is one of the things that really affects eutrophication is the dissolved oxygen.
Yeah, it isn't oxygen-rich water anymore.
Right, this part of algal growth is what consumes. So it's like when you're putting, you mentioned agriculture, when you're putting fertilizer for plants, what do plants do? They grow, right? And they grow well. So what happens when you put like nutrients into the water? The algae, which are plant, will grow and bloom, but they will bloom so much that they will take over the entire oxygen because they use oxygen to grow, right? And that is what happens, that the algae would then take over everything. So the dissolved oxygen was already seen to be declining at that point.
And the problem that you have there is then as the algae starts dying, you also have the smell and losing more of the oxygen within the river. So it's a very tricky situation. Now, you have to also bear in mind that the river, Orange Walk Town, does not, for example, have a sewer system. You have the tortillas that are also there. Everything goes into the river. So when you're talking about the eutrophication, it means that there's something in there that they can feed on in the first place, right? Heat may not allow that kind of feeding, right? And Seidy can explain it. Even I'm trying to do a layman's explanation. But you understand, so it's a number of factors that you have happening at the same time, along with the changes in the weather, that makes this a perfect situation for the river to actually get sick and stressed.
What I'm hearing
Usually
from
what happens, one final thing, usually what happens then is the rains come and it washes everything out. And you also have a reverse, perhaps, of the sea ingress. So you don't have that increase in salinity. You will have the river changing its flow and going out into the sea as opposed to the sea coming into the river.
Well, what I'm hearing from both of you is that you want to take the opportunity to tell people that you have been doing all these processes to ensure that you are returning safe water back to the river. And especially in a time where people just see a green, very unhealthy river and they're saying, listen, the biggest industry is B.S.I, it must be them. But there's something else that's been triggered in my mind, because if you have submitted continuous records to the Department of Environment, and from May you were seeing a problem, and it doesn't even take a scientist to realize that, especially in the north, there is a drought. There's a very serious drought taking place. So this problem perhaps was a bit foreseen from before.
From our end, we could see that there was a trend, because we know normally we know that as crop is coming to an end, I mean, this is when the rain starts, the temperature gets higher. So we monitor. Salinity, for instance, is something that we do internally, because we know that the flow in the river for the last years has been changing. The new river is affected by the tides, right? And so we have seen that it has gotten progressively worse. For instance, if you look at the charts that we have, you would see that for May, it went to almost to the salinity level being close to 0 to almost spiking up way to above 3, which is, or 5 even. You can clearly see it. So we do know that there are many factors. I think at the end of the day, what we want to see, or what we want people to see, is that there are many variables, and in order for the river to get better, everybody has to do their part. We are doing our part, and by even in temperature, we realize that we have a temperature issue, but we are not outside our ECP, because that is one parameter that we have to meet by a specific time frame. That time frame has not expired. Over the years, we have made significant investment to ensure that that we focus on that particular area. For instance, we've invested in the creation at the end of the cooling pond. We have a retention wall in order for us to increase retention time before it's being discharged. Also, for us to have a cascading effect, because that's one of the ways where you dissipate, temperature or heat or the excess temperature.
That when we do the teacup to cool something down. So that's kind of what you're talking about. I want people to be clear on it. But there are other industries in Orange Walk as well. And so my question, has there ever been perhaps a consolidation of efforts perhaps, or talks of working along with, so what you have is a standard that you've actually learned, I think, over the years, that you needed to do this before you returned the water back to the river. But perhaps what you can do is then work with other industries. We have alcohol being made in Orange Walk. We have the corn. We have other agricultural products being done. So there's a lot that is taking place just in this inland area. And it's also, as I said, more susceptible as an inland area to drought. Have you ever considered perhaps working with other industries and talking through the process, so collectively there's work being done?
I think 2 years ago, if my memory serves me right, or a little bit more than 2 years ago, there was a whole conversation with Friends of the New River. And we started there. And initially, everybody came. And again, there was kind of this, flurry of who's to blame. And I think that's not the way that we want to look at this situation. You asked earlier about the changes that we noticed. Could you stop it? You can't really at that point, because you're creating this perfect situation for the river to be totally stressed, and the weather makes it even worse. So how do you get everybody to come to the table? B.S.I continues to invest a lot of money to do its part. And with the monitoring, it's a sharing and a collaboration with the D.O.E. So we've invested in a boat, for example, with a captain, so we can do all of the monitoring that is necessary. There's so many things that we've done, and we have these frequent conversations with the DOE because that's important. What we want to do is to bring everybody to the table. If you're going to say that, okay, who's to blame, and because there are so many contributing factors, you also have to realistically have an independent kind of approach to say, okay, everybody comes to the table and let's see what we're all doing, which includes the town council, right? Which includes people from the town, understanding what their contributions are. And it's that kind of a situation where when it gets to this point, everybody's irate, everybody's
everybody
upset.
wants to blame someone.
And it's more emotional as opposed to taking a
Proactive
proactive approach, because you see this happening on an annual basis.
You know, I'm no scientist. I won't even pretend to be. And so my question when I look at what's happening is there a single cause or are there multiple causes? And I know the weather pattern is one. When you talk about the salinity or the salt in the river, my assumption is it's because of the seawater that comes in, but I don't know. So clearly there are multiple causes
Variables
to this issue. And what you're saying is you kind of want a collective approach where other people who you know are impacting the river come to the table and you all look at what you are doing collectively and seeing what you can do to mitigate the extent of this problem. But when I asked, and you know, it's kind of too late to undo or to reduce or perhaps, but beyond looking at a stinky green river, we need to look at the health implications of it. And if you were able to see from May that there were changes being made, and we have to be honest, the Department of Environment only responded to this issue after the story ran, and after that subsequently wanted to do public consultations. Is there any way the public or other people can be able to access your river monitoring data, so perhaps they don't have to wait until DOE raises a flag and says, okay, now that we see the river is green, please don't drink from it or use it?
We can't speak on behalf of the DOE.
No, I'm asking if your data can be accessible.
But that would be something that it's a requirement under what we have with our environmental compliance plan.
Yeah.
So that's why we share that information with the DOE. But once it goes to the DOE, it's generally public information. So other entities can get that information directly.
Okay.
I would also like to mention, in terms of the temperature monitoring, we've had a challenge, you know, in terms of data gaps. Why? We have, you heard about these sampling points that we have along the river.
Yeah.
Well, we are of the belief, we have professionals, we have scientists that look at these data, but you need data in order for you to be able to make definitive conclusions. You cannot base your conclusion on one grab sample. It's very scientific. So what we've done is installed continuous monitoring device, because we know that temperature is an issue where we have a challenge. We have installed data loggers. So what do these equipment do? Really, they are installed and they record every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day, the temperature of the river. A challenge has been that many times we lose them. We lose them because people are curious, they see these little things out in the river and they steal it, or they tamper with it, they remove the batteries, and when we go and do our inspection, you don't get it, you have data gaps. But the way that the company works, it's very focused on ensuring that whatever projects we invest in, they are backed up by data, because we are monitoring those data. Because chances are, if you don't do that, then how can you arrive at definitive conclusions? And because we have done our homework, because we have been monitoring, we have the lab, our lab that does all these analyses. And not only that, we also send those tests or the same samples to an external lab, to a credible lab in the country, for them to verify that actually the results that the company is getting at its lab match with what this third-party lab is indicating. So we know that, we can always, we have not only one aspect of monitoring, but we have two. We have our internal one and external analysis. And going back to, the community, I find that we are here to indicate that, yes, they are different variables. The problem is that whenever they see this greening, the first thing they do, let's take samples. But are you taking samples of what is an effect? I mean, because you will find dissolved oxygen, but this is an effect of everything that has been happening in the river. So how can you say, if you find dissolved oxygen at, I would say, at San Esteban Bridge or Trial Farm or even B.S.I, you can't say that, oh, it's caused there. It's just an effect of what is happening throughout the river. And that is why I am saying the important thing is that if there is to be a solution, there has to be also an investment, and I would say time as well, to ensure that there is proper monitoring, because there's not one single cause. There are several causes, and unless we do this, then we will always be just pointing the finger at one specific cause, which is not the way. And the thing is, even after you solve that problem, you will still have the same effect on the river, and then you will wonder, what now, right?
Who else is monitoring other than B.S.I?
Nobody.
Yeah. We are the only, I think that is something that we pride ourselves, because we have data for many years, and we have been testing for different parameters. We have both physical parameters in terms of like, when we send externally, we also do micro-B. And one thing I must mention, that we did send our results to the external lab, and we did find that there was an increased level of coliforms, of bacteria. E. coli, we had fecal coliforms.
To be clear, it comes from the toilet.
Yeah.
That's what you're
or
talking
sewage,
about.
or another. B.S.I doesn't contribute to that, but yet, based on our external analysis that we did, because we don't have that capability to do that on site, we sent it out, and the results came back that the amounts were TCC, too numerous, TNC, too numerous to count. So that means that it is high. I am not saying that somebody is dumping whatever on the river, but all indications are that there is something that is contributing to this.
Well, let me be fair to you. There are documented issues of fecal bacteria in the reef. So we know it's going in the river and eventually to the sea and to the reef. And the sewer problem is perhaps another issue we need to take a very serious look at. But we need to focus on Orange Walk and the residents and them wanting to see a healthy river. What are you're here, I think, to clarify what you're doing. But how do you move forward? So there's a problem, and people want to see some action taking place. D.O.E is talking about consultations. I don't know who else gets involved at this point, but what is your role now?
Well, we'll continue to do what we're doing and definitely engaging with the D.O.E. But I think what needs to be done at this point is not necessarily just looking at this as a challenge that we can't come together and find a solution. It just means that we can't do it separately. There is a cost consideration that is significant, because when you're talking about doing the testing and the monitoring and looking for all these things, even for algae within the river, somebody has to take on that cost. And it can't be a singular entity that is doing all of this. It means that everybody who's concerned has to come seriously to the table and say what they're willing to contribute to in terms of making sure that the health of the river is sustained on an annual basis and into perpetuity. So it requires serious consideration, serious commitment, and
Time
investment and time.
And experts as well to be engaged.
Expertise.
All right. Have you been contacted by the Department of Environment at all?
We had a meeting on Friday actually, and we went over quite a bit of the information, and we will continue to work with them, and that was prior to their meeting with the town council and to have the consultation. And I think for us, we continue to look at this as a serious concern for us because the health of the river is something that we pay attention, and we've invested time and money to work towards ensuring that we're doing our part. We want to challenge other people to come on board and do their part as well.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming in and making this clarification, and we do hope that B.S.I, A.S.R, and the other stakeholders can be able to perhaps come together and work towards a solution.
Thank you very much for having us.
We're going to go ahead and take that final break. We'll have our wrap-up.